This program was sponsored by the Jesse and John Dans Fund. Since 1962, these lectures have been a forum for distinguished scholars of national and international reputation who have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe.
Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Feetham, and I'm Acting Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Washington and Vice Provost. On behalf of the Graduate School, which sponsors this lecture, I am honored and pleased to welcome you here tonight to this overflow crowd for this lecture. I want to talk to you a little bit before we start about how we came to have these lectures. This visiting professorship was established in 1961 through a bequest from the estate of Mr. John Dans. Mr. Dans came to Seattle in the early part of the 20th century, and he was very successful as an entrepreneur. Some of you who have lived in this region for a while may remember the chain of movie theaters that he established here in the Seattle area and in neighboring states. John Dans was a self-educated man who read widely and liberally. He was fascinated by scientific developments and was particularly interested in the philosophy of humanism. In creating this endowment, his goal was to bring distinguished lecturers and scholars of international reputation to the University of Washington. He particularly was interested in having lecturers who have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe. After Mr. Dance's death, his wife Jessie continued to contribute to this endowment until her death. Several members of the Dans family may be here this evening, and we'd like to show our appreciation for this gift to the University of Washington and to the region from the Dans family. Our speaker tonight will be introduced by Dr. Sutapa Basu, Executive Director of the University of Washington Women's Center and Affiliate Assistant Professor of Women's Studies.
Good evening, welcome. This is exciting to see all of you here. Thank you for coming. I, of course, have the great honor of introducing one of my favorite feminist scholars and activists in the whole wide world. And it is true. And I want to share with you how I came to know Dr. Hooks. When I was a budding feminist, I attended the National Women's Studies Conference in 1987 at Spelman College in Atlanta. And that's the first time I heard her speak, and I immediately became her groupie. I attended every lecture and every seminar she gave and was literally in awe. So I feel very honored to be here, and who would have known that 18 years later I would have the honor of introducing her, so I'm very grateful. Dr. Bell Hooks is one of America's most indispensable and independent thinkers and celebrated as one of our nation's leading public intellectuals, as well as one of Utne Reader's 100 visionaries who could change your life, and she definitely has mine. Dr. Hooks describes herself as a Black woman intellectual, revolutionary activist, and that's no lie. The author of many books and essays, Hooks has focused attention on the various forms of racism, from subtle to blatant, in the United States. She has criticized the way in which the plight of Black women has been either ignored or worsened by the mainstream feminist movement and the Black liberation struggle. Dr. Bell Hooks was born to Gloria Jean Watkins on September 25, 1952, in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Her family's love of poetry inspired her to write verses of her own, some of which were published in a local Sunday school magazine. After graduating from high school, Bell Hooks enrolled at Stanford University, where she obtained a BA in English in 1973. 3 years later, she earned her master's degree in the same subject at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She then embarked on her teaching career, serving as an English professor and a senior lecturer in ethnic studies at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. In the early 1980s, she taught courses in creative writing, African American literature, composition, and other subjects at various institutions, including the University of California at Santa Cruz and San Francisco State University. Concurrently, she worked towards her doctorate, which she received from the University of California at Santa Cruz in 1983. Dr. Hooks published her first full-length work, Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism, a book she began writing when she was 19 years old. And as you know, since then, Dr. Hooks has authored numerous critically acclaimed and influential books on the politics of race, gender, class, and culture. In 1985, Bell Hooks taught African and Afro-American Studies and English at Yale University. In 1988, she was an associate professor of women's studies and American literature at Oberlin College. And in 1994, she accepted the post of distinguished professor of English at the City College of New York. And later in the same year, she received the Writers' Award, which brought with it a cash prize of $105,000 from the Leela Wallace Reader's Digest Fund. And presently, she is a distinguished professor at Berea College in Kentucky. In her interview with Rebecca Corral, that is for the Elle magazine, Hooks says, quote, "My idea of a delicious time is to read a book that is wonderful. And then I have the usual passions, romance and fashion. I am totally into shoes, so I am a big fashion girl, and I'm really into art and deeply into culture. I am passionate about living my life with a certain quality of elegance and grace. But the ruling passion of my life is being a seeker after truth and the divine. That tempers everything else. As Shirley Chisholm said, the law cannot, quote, "The law cannot do the job of winning equality for women. Women must do it for themselves. Women must become revolutionaries." Friends and colleagues, please join me in welcoming one of the great revolutionaries of our time, Dr. Bell Hooks.
Okay, this is why I always have to say I love Seattle. Why aren't I moving to Seattle? I've been saying all day. I'm joined here tonight by Paul and Pam, who are our signers for the evening. We thank you. Now, I know that people have been wondering, because they've asked me today, well, who are you in conversation with? And I said, I'm going to be in conversation with all of you. And I posed it that way to Yvette Moy, whom I want to say all praise for all the effort that she made to make this event possible. And what I want to do is spend some time talking about where I am in my work. And I know there are lots of people out there who read my work. And so part of why I wanted to be in dialogue and conversation is so that people can ask different things about the different things that you think about in relation to bell hooks, and I can share some of the things that I've been talking about today with people. I wanted to start really by talking about my most recent work, which is focused so much on men. And I've had a lot of critique about that. The last two books, The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, and We Real Cool, Black Men in Masculinity. And it seems to me that there could be no more important historical moment to talk about men again and patriarchy than right now. Now that we have a government that is so committed to re-inscribing and reinstitutionalizing patriarchy. Earlier today, I was talking with students and saying that these words like gay marriage or family values, they're actually just code words for patriarchy. For how, let's have the reinscription of patriarchy. Because whenever we talk about marriage in heterosexist culture, unchanged, unreconstructed, heterosexist, patriarchal culture, what marriage are we talking about? What kind of marriage are we talking about people wanting to have? Mostly people think people want to have the kind of marriage that patriarchy has already told us is the best way to couple. So when we advocate for any kind of different, without changing language, without talking about what we are really wanting, what kind of coupling are we wanting, we end up reinscribing heterosexism, heterosexist practice, even if the people involved are not heterosexual. So those are the things that I've been really thinking about. Things about who really goes around giving lectures that are anti-feminist. I've been thinking a lot about the viciousness of patriarchy. Because I tell everybody, you know, Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, they have people come to the White House and talk about race. You know, they even have discussions about gender. But the silent discourse in our culture is really about patriarchy. That's what no one wants to sit around chatting about. And I told students earlier that right after the elections, I did this talk with Gloria Steinem and Hyung Kung Chao, the Korean woman theologian that some of you may know. And I was talking about the fact that no matter who you chose to vote for, Bush or Kerry, the one thing that we had to talk about was that when it came to the issue of gender and patriarchy, these individuals don't really think differently. That the vision of the world that they put forth is rooted in the same kind of patriarchal thinking. And it seems, for many of us old people, you know, who have been militantly questioning, as feminist thinkers, as lovers of justice, the question of patriarchy, why is it so hard now to bring patriarchy to the table, to talk to people about what are we really meaning when we say family values? Let's face it, isn't the patriarchal family one of the most fucked up family systems in the world? You know? So how can we really talk about family values without talking about transforming patriarchy and domination? I want to start with that because of the crisis in masculinity that I want to tell you that only feminism has offered to men the hope of breaking free from patriarchal thinking. Every female wants to be loved by a male. Every woman wants to love and be loved by the males in her life. Whether gay or straight, bisexual or celibate, she wants to feel the love of father, grandfather, uncle, brother, male partner, or son. Think about all the lesbians that are having sons and who want them to be males that they can love from childhood into adulthood. We live in a culture where emotionally starved, deprived females are desperately seeking male love. Our collective hunger is so intense it rends us, and yet we dare not speak it for fear we will be mocked, pitied, shamed. To speak our hunger for male love would demand that we name the intensity of our lack and our loss. The male bashing that was so intense when contemporary feminism first surfaced more than 30 years ago was in part the rageful cover-up of the shame women felt not because men refused to share their power, but because we could not seduce, cajole, or entice men to share their emotions, to love us. I am sometimes amazed. Aren't you amazed by the incredible changes that have happened in gender in relation to work? And that really, it's when you look at the emotional lives of women and men that you see so little change. It sometimes awes me because I feel like, I tell people all the time, you know, I remember what it was like as many women in this room who are 50 and older when we were being told that women couldn't fly airplanes because our arms just weren't strong enough. Or I was talking with students today about how men would say, well, of course women have to be the typists because our big fat male fingers just can't possibly use typewriters as good as women. And I was talking about how one of the most profound revolutions in our nation has been our use of computers. And those same ruling class, mostly white men who claim that their fat little fingers, you know, couldn't do the typing, have in fact become those fingers that are typing all the time on their little Palm Pilots, on their little iPods, things. And I always think about this because it reminds me that nonviolent revolutions can take place when they have the right PR. You know, when people are told, because people cross-class use computers because they've been told that if they don't know how to use a computer, they can't be modern, they can't be with the world, they can't know what's going on. And you know, I meet taxi drivers, I meet all kinds of people who are using computers who, if you had told them 10 years ago that they would be typing away, many of those patriarchal men would have just said, well, it's just not possible. My fingers won't do this. Even though many men today have a clearer awareness of their need for emotional fulfillment, the essence of what most folk take to be a man has changed little. Maleness continues to be seen as strength, invulnerability, maintaining a competitive edge. Emotional openness and honesty are still among the sacrifices that must be made by men to patriarchal masculinity. I focus so on patriarchy because citizens in this nation fear challenging patriarchy, even as they lack overt awareness that they're fearful. So deeply embedded in our collective unconscious are the rules of patriarchy. I mean, I know many of you probably have heard me say before, I often say this, that if you go door to door in America and you ask people if men should beat women, most people will say no. But if you tell them that the only way that we can end patriarchal male violence against women is to challenge patriarchy, you see that cognitive dissonance right there. They don't want to challenge patriarchy. It's sort of like when my women students who are heterosexual say, oh, you know, I want to be equal, but I really want a man who can take control and, you know, and you try to say to them, like, these are contradictions, you know, that, and you see how desperately People want to hold on to the logic of patriarchy even as they talk about change. Okay, I'm reading from these different pages and trying to be short so we can talk. But I like this sentence. I say, patriarchy promotes insanity. It is at the root of the psychological ills troubling men in our nation. Patriarchy as a system has denied males access to full emotional well-being, which is not the same as feeling rewarded, successful, or powerful because of one's capacity to assert control over others. To truly address male pain and male crisis, we must, as a nation, be willing to expose the harsh reality that patriarchy has damaged men in the past and continues to damage them in the present. So far in our nation, feminist movement is the only struggle for justice that emphasizes the need to end patriarchy. No mass body of women have challenged patriarchy, and neither has any group of men come together to lead the struggle. The crisis facing men is not the crisis of masculinity. It is the crisis of patriarchal masculinity. Until we make this distinction clear, men will continue to fear that any critique of patriarchy represents a threat. Let me kind of deconstruct that or explain that a little more fully, because I think a lot of times we think about maleness and we think about that as being what patriarchy is, so that the hatred of men or the anger towards men doesn't allow people to see that there's a difference between, I say, loving that person who's born with a penis, who is male, and loving patriarchy or being a patriarch. And that's been hard for a lot of people to understand. I say here, undoubtedly, one of the first revisionary acts of revolutionary feminism must be to restore maleness and masculinity as an ethical, biological category divorced from the dominator model. This is why the term patriarchal masculinity is so important, for it identifies male difference as being always and only about the superior rights of males to be dominant, be their subordinates females, or any group deemed weaker by any means necessary. Rejecting this model for a feminist masculinity means that we must define maleness as a state of being rather than as performance. Male being, maleness, masculinity must stand for the essential core goodness of the self, of the human body that has a penis. Many of the critics who've written about masculinity suggest that we need to do away with the term, that we need an end to manhood. Yet such a stance furthers the notion that there's something inherently evil, bad, or unworthy about maleness. It was really as I was doing my book on Black masculinity that I thought I really began to see the depths of our society's hatred of maleness and of our allegiance to patriarchal thinking, where we really don't want males to be whole. I mean, I was laughing with people that the only thing I've found myself to have in common with the Bush administration is Laura Bush's concern for boys. Because I too am concerned about the well-being and the welfare of boys, especially Black boys in our nation. But I think that we would differ deeply on what we think the answer to the crisis of, masculinity is. To offer men and women, boys and girls, a different way of being, we must first replace the dominator model with a partnership model that sees interbeing and interdependency as the organic relationship of all living beings. In the partnership model, selfhood, whether one is female or male, is always at the core of one's identity. Visionary feminism is a wise and loving politics. It is rooted in the love of male and female being, refusing to privilege one over the other. The soul of feminist politics is the commitment to ending patriarchal domination of women and men, girls and boys. Love cannot exist in any relationship that is based on domination and coercion. When men embrace feminist thinking and practice, which emphasizes the value of mutual growth and self-actualization in all relationships, their emotional well-being will be enhanced. A genuine feminist politics always brings us from bondage to freedom, from lovelessness to loving. Mutual partnership is the foundation of love. Feminist thought and action create the conditions under which mutuality can be nurtured. In Illuminati, Marianne Williamson writes that we have more faith in the power of violence to destroy us than we have in the faith of love to restore us. To move towards a culture of mutuality and partnership, we must reclaim spirituality. For spirituality remains one of the few locations where the value of love is taught. As I've said, I've turned my attention a lot to the question of maleness, and I tried to write, this is my first children's book that I wrote directed mainly at a boy audience, at boys, but one of the things that it challenged me is to how do you write a non-patriarchal book? How do you celebrate maleness, the boy, without reinscribing patriarchy? So I tried to do this with B-Boy Buzz. So I want to conclude by reading my two children's books. And while I've been here in Seattle, I've talked a lot about what it has meant for me as an intellectual, as an academic, as a critical thinker to begin really investing heavily in writing for children. B-Boy Buzz says, I, B-Boy, all bliss boy, all fine beat, all bow boy beautiful, all bad boy beast, all boy. I be boy running, I be boy jumping, boy sitting down, I be boy laughing, crying, telling my story, talking way too loud, then sitting, all quiet, still, all boy, hug me close, don't let me down, all boy, big open heart, sweet mind, all thinking dream time, alone with myself, all ready for the world to come and see, to see and play, all B-Boy Buzz, in love with being a boy. Because there are so many students here, when you create a book and then you try to sell it to a corporation, my books are published by Disney Hyperion. And often when you write a children's book, you don't choose the illustrator, but I work a lot with Chris Roshka, who is a white male, who has a little boy who reads all the time. And yet when Chris first created this page, All Thinking Dream Time, alone with myself, there was no image of the boy on the page. And I went to him and to the group that I work with, and I said, black males are becoming the most illiterate group of people in our nation. We can't have this book where these boys are just running and jumping. There must be a page in which this boy is reading, and that we affirm the right of black boys to be still, to be quiet, to literacy. And so I want to share that because I think we come to college, and we do all this race, gender, class stuff, but when you get out in the real world of money, because when these pages are changed, it costs money. So that one has to go to the collaborative table with other people, mostly white. Publishing in the United States continues to be primarily a predominantly white world. And when you go to that world and you say, this isn't acceptable, you count on having people who will listen. So I want to say that part of my hope in the world comes from the fact that even in the midst of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, and people's allegiance to it, there are so many people, like many of you in this room, who love justice, so that the white people that I work with, who struggle to be aware, can hear me talk about the literacy issues of black boys and are willing to spend the money to go back to the drawing room, that Chris is willing to hear me say, we need a boy on that page reading a book, and not get uptight and say, but I'm the artist, and this is my vision, but is willing to work with me. So I want you to think about that process as we talk about taking the knowledge that we may get in cultural studies or critical thinking about race and gender into a real concrete world of economics. I'm going to read my newest book, which Gilda has to bring to me because she took it. This is my long-term Seattle colleague and friend, Gilda. I was telling people today that my newest book is called Skin Again, and it was really prompted by the growing rate of suicide attempts by biracial children in our nation, whether they're Afro-Asian or black and white or black and Latina or what have you, as children in our nation struggle in this world of binaries to deal with their identities. And I want to just read this little book first and hope that you will hear in the reading of it how I try to problematize the question of identity politics. What does it mean to love who I am, but at the same time, in my skin, to recognize that I'm more than my skin? And how can we hold those two realities together? The skin I'm in is just a covering. It cannot tell my story. The skin I am in is just a covering. If you want to know who I am, you've got to come inside and open your heart way wide. The skin I'm in looks good to me. It will let you know one small way to trace my identity. But then again, the skin I'm in will always be just a covering. It cannot tell my story. If you want to know who I am, you've got to come inside. Be with me inside the me of me, all made up of stories, present, past, future, some true to life and others all fun and fantasy, all the ways I imagine me. You can find all about me coming close and letting go of who you might think I am before you come inside and let me be real. And you become real to me. All real then in that place where skin again is one small way to see me, but not real enough to be all the me of me or the you of you. For we are all inside made up of real history, real dreams, and the stuff of all we hope for when we can all be real together on the inside. And what I hoped, I was telling students earlier that if you're aware of my children's books, I mainly write for 2-, and 3-, and 4-year-olds. And when we did this book, we became aware that it was very hard for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds to read this book and get it by themselves. And what has happened organically is that it has a population of readers that are more 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds who are grappling with the question of identity. So that I come to you tonight very, very grateful for my mind, for being able to think in this manner about race, class, gender, identity in a way that is liberating to children, because I really believe that that is where our critical thinking and our critical pedagogy can have the most impact. I talked today about the fact that there are two institutions in our nation that I think are really crucial, and they are the public school and the public library. And that, you know, if you're really concerned about the welfare of children, get involved with the question of literacy. You don't have to go to a third world country to find people who don't have access to books, to reading. And that's not to diminish in any way our efforts to share with other countries, but I've moved, as many of you know, back from New York City to a little town in Kentucky, which is my native state. And there, the literacy rates in the state of Kentucky are very, very bad. And among the poor, the face of poverty in America is primarily white. You find many people without the skills of reading and writing. Give books to your library, get involved, get engaged with public schools if we want to make a difference in the lives of children in our nation in terms of creating that kind of world where they can love who they are and yet know the limits of things like race, sexual practice, all those things that we use to define ourselves. So I want to stop there and open things up. If you're going on too long, I'll stop you because we don't have forever. So I'll try to be like Buddhist loving kindness and say, who's ready to start us off with a question? Say your name, speak loudly. We have like about 30 minutes, 30 or 35 minutes to talk together. Who's ready? Yes, don't hesitate. Come, my sister.
I belong to a New Thought spiritual community of about 400 people that's predominantly white, and I'm on the board, so they're interested in being inclusive. And so I'm trying to talk to them about patriarchy and sexism, and they get this glazed look on their face and look at me like I'm crazy. And so I'm trying to figure out, you know, where to start and how to move them along where they say they want to go.
Well, a lot of what we talked about earlier today in classes and in groups was, what does it mean to start with people where they are? To ask people, what are your belief systems? And how open are you? How willing are you to change? I find that because I live in the Bible Belt, where people are constantly quoting Scripture and constantly using Scripture in fascist ways, that it's really important to, you know, to be able to talk to people about those aspects of Scripture that invite them into radical openness. Let's try Romans. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may know what the will of God is. Now, Martin Luther King used that particular passage because he was basically a very conservative guy in many ways. But when he was called, remember, I admire Dr. King precisely because he struggled so when it came to opposing the war in Vietnam. And some of you may have read the piece I wrote on him 2 months ago in Shambhala Sun, the Buddhist magazine, where I talked about the fact that Dr. King really prayed and meditated about, you know, everybody loves me. How can I oppose the war? And he kept pondering from that passage from Romans and asking himself, how can I say that I worship a God of love and support war? And in that constant interrogation, that existential self-reflection, he was moved to realize that he could not fully embody the practice of God as a God of love without opposing what he called the giant triplets of imperialism, militarism, and materialism. So that I think that it's really important if we go to people with those passages, with those places where we invite them into the radical openness of liberating spirituality. Your question?
In the mid-90s, you were involved in Marlon Riggs' film, Black Is, Black Ain't. I teach that film in my class, and one of the things that sticks with the students, and they struggle with it, I'd like you to talk a little bit about it, is your discussion of the difference between community and communion.
Oh, wow, that's a really hard one, I feel, to talk about. You mean the difference between...
You talked about the idea of us thinking about community ultimately as a monolithic way of thinking, and communion actually being about the gathering of spirits of multiple perspectives.
And also, I think communion is being about where you are, because we're back to where you are. And I've been telling people that the little town that I live in Kentucky, I teach at Berea College, which is an interesting college in our nation because it was created by a white man who had a spiritual vision that God had called him to create this college where women could be educated equally with men, where black people from Appalachia especially and the white poor should be educated so people don't pay tuition. It's a need-based college. And one of the things that happened is he created this utopian community that the government shut down in 1905 because black and white people were living there in a humane way. But my point is that in going to live there, I'm living in one of the whitest communities that I've ever lived in, and I was asking my sister, who's not happy in her life in Flint, Michigan, and many of you know Flint, Michigan from Michael Moore's films, Roger and Me and Fahrenheit 9/11, and she says to me, well, I can't move there because there are just not enough black people. And I said to her, well, okay, if you got 50 toxic, dysfunctional black people and 5 healthy, functional black people who would really love you and support you and nurture your growth, which is the community and the communion that you choose? And I think that for all of us, and some of you heard me on the radio today talking about anti-intellectualism, we live in a society that makes it very hard for people to think in a complex way. And that part of the assault of racism and white supremacy on black people's consciousness and people of color in general is we start thinking that, oh, if we just herd together, you know, we will be safe, we will be treated better. And what we find is we herd together often, in a lot of the internalized forms of dominator thinking impinge upon our lives in such a way that we don't find the community or the communion, and that we'll evoke community, but it's really kind of nonsense because the communion can only take place in a functional setting, in a functional reality. You know, so that lots of us are wedded to, quote, communities that we say, oh, I'm in the community, but we're being a part of a very dysfunctional community, you know, white, black, or whatever, without really critiquing that. So I think in evoking that sense of communion, as it's talked about by so many, especially theologians, Henry Nouwen is one of my real spiritual teachers in his work, the Jesuit priest who passed away a couple of years ago now, is to think about communion as requiring of us agency and subjectivity. In order to commune with you, I have to know who I am. I can't come to the table empty. Because people said that of Zora Neale Hurston. She didn't come to the table empty. She always brought something. Genuine intimacy requires reciprocity, mutuality. And those are the things that distinguish a kind of pseudo-community from communion. I really like M. Scott Peck's book on community, and I'm forgetting the title of it, as he distinguishes in that book, but you can easily find it. Your question?
I teach a class at a local high school, and just recently we were reading part of Teaching to Transgress, and they wanted me to ask you your opinion on what happens when the language of the oppressed becomes co-opted by the oppressors.
Well, I mean, the thing that I would, if I were teaching my students and they raised at high school students, is like, I would first want us to think about what is the language of the oppressed? Isn't the language of the oppressed already a working of our anguish? Isn't our vernacular speech not unlike the blues? That it is shaped and informed by our relationship to history and to the moment, so that rather than thinking about it being co-opted, we would think about it starting in that place of domination, and the question would be, how do we really free it? What makes it ours? You know, I mean, when Langston Hughes tried to take that standard English and put it together with black vernacular, he was in effect trying to take back that world, you know. I said to my baby, baby, take it slow. He said, I can't, I gotta go. A certain amount of traveling in a dream deferred. Lula said to Leonard, I want a diamond ring. Leonard said to Lula, you won't get a goddamn thing. A certain amount of nothing in a dream deferred. Daddy, 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 all I want is you. You can have me, baby, but my loving days are through. A certain amount of nothing in a dream deferred. Now, what Langston Hughes was trying to do in that sequence was to contrast the vernacular language of black experience born out of oppression and exploitation, the forced migration of black southern people into northern cities, and to unite that with standard English to give voice. So we have to talk about the fact that there's never been a disconnection. I mean, I think one of the false consciousness of our times is that there's some black culture that operates in some separate category distinct from the forces of domination, that much of what we call black culture has really been our response to and our reaction to. And it has not, in that sense, always been an organically liberating culture. So that I think to talk to students about that, where does your language come from? What language do you dream in? If we feel there's some language that is taken from us, how do we reclaim it? Is there any language of authenticity in dominator culture? It's like, I think, getting students to throw those questions back and interrogate and ask themselves is where power lies. Question?
I first came to know your work as an undergrad at my alma mater, San Francisco State University, where I was first introduced to logical thought as a young Latina who was raised in poverty in my ethnic studies class there. And I've always remembered that experience and carry it with me deeply. I am now the mother of a 2.5-year-old who loves your Happy to Be Nappy book.
Thank you.
And I am currently, I'm an early childhood professional educator, and I am currently teaching seminars and classes to other early childhood professionals on recognizing sexism, racism, and all the other isms and stereotypes, how to recognize those in children's media and books. Could you speak a little bit more about your children's books and the importance of starting with the very youngest children at 2.5 and up, on how to recognize those things in books that are good for them?
Well, I think it's amazing to me as a feminist who started out with feminism at a time when we were really obsessed. Do you remember that old-time feminist in the room when we had all this stuff about free children and books for free children? And there was a lot of concern about children's books. And let me tell you, a lot of that concern has been totally tossed away. That a lot of the leading children's books, like Harry Potter, for example, I mean, Harry Potter is just a little hotbed of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal thinking. And then here's something to problematize. A lot of people will say, well, that's true, but my son that never read a book, you know, is reading, and so I'm just so excited about Harry Potter. And I say to people, the danger of that is that we don't demand more and better for boys. Why should there just be a couple of books that we think this can excite the imagination of boy readers? So I feel like all of you out there who are thinking about writing children's books, there's a great dearth of books that are trying to be about justice. And I find that, I really didn't want to write very didactic books for kids that would be, I feel like, especially children of color, if you contrast the books that are aimed at children of color, they're always like heavy, on the like didacticism and low on the playfulness and the sort of lightheartedness. So it seems to me that we still have the mission to create those books. And there are publishing companies that are trying to focus on representations of people of color in the world of children's books. But we have to, I tell people when I did B-Boy Buzz, buy a boy a book. That we have to do the work not just of writing and producing, but seeing that books get into the hands of children. And again, when we talk about, I think of sometimes sort of low-level activism. Like low-level activism, that doesn't cost you that much effort, might be simply buying a child who doesn't have a book and reading it to them. Having them read it to you. And searching for the kinds of books that are life-enhancing. Your question?
Hi, my name is Bob Chapman, and I'm wondering what your thinking is about. I do a lot of thinking about binary subject positions, and coming from Appalachia myself, growing up in Crab Orchard, Kentucky, and thinking about being Appalachian but white and male and middle class, and how I'm very privileged, but I know I have binary subject positions because I'm gay in this society. And so I wonder about how do you mobilize people and how do you maintain that strength then to look at people, not just children, and I applaud your work on children, but what about the 38-year-old who stands next to me who has no concept of privilege and whiteness? And how do you continue to mobilize that person because they need to be just as involved as the work that we do to influence children? So how do I mobilize them? And in addition to that, the university professor who sits in front of you who just has created a new box for themselves at the end of their PhD rainbow and says to you, no, you really can't write about that. You can't talk about that. When you say, F you, no, yes, I can write about that because this is the work I want to do in social justice. And how do you stand up to that and mobilize them to meet you someplace in the middle?
Well, I think, too, that, I think the very language of that is how can we mobilize others is that language, again, of us and them that says, I have the power, and how can I use my power to mobilize someone else, rather than asking, what does the struggle of justice have to offer this individual? I talked earlier today about, right after the election, when I was talking at Columbia with Gloria and Hyung Kung Chao, that when I talked about the fact that there are positive aspects of who Mr. Bush is that we might need to fixate on, and I was booed heavily by the audience. And I was reminded again of how that binary thinking of who is good and who is bad, and that often we say that we want justice, but in fact we're always often on the left judging that people who don't think like us, so that we become no different from that right-wing world, that world of, it's a different kind of fascism where we're saying that there's no hope for this category of people. There's just hope for people like ourselves. So I think that when we think about anybody that we want to share liberatory thinking with, we have to be willing to say, what does this liberatory thinking mean for their life? What does liberatory thinking mean for your life if you're a ruling class person who uses your money in ways that intensify injustice? What does it mean if you have to consider that the change in your thinking or your habits of being involve an incredible change in your life? And I think that we're not a culture that embraces change and makes it easy for people to change. So that I feel like there's the constant Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron says, start where you are. And I think we have to give everyone else the opportunity to start where they are. I have one other question, and it's time for me to close.
Hi, I'm a high school student, and I'm currently taking a course taught by Tracy Lai. It's called Women, Race, and Class, and we talk a lot about the struggles of women of color specifically, and we've read books about Black women, Latina and Chicana women, Asian women, and Indigenous women, but we've talked about their struggles kind of separately. And I was wondering, how can we create a feminist movement that brings together all women of color and also brings white women in? How can we trust them again from all the history that's happened? You know, like what's your take on that?
Well, I think that my take on that is that, first of all, the work of trust can happen, a restoration of trust, only when there is recognition of our realities and where we stand. And I think that's what visionary feminists fought so hard to say, that until we can actually identify our locations within this system, you know, when I can, as bell hooks, talk about myself as exploited and oppressed by race, but then I also have to talk now about my enormous class privilege. You know, I think that as we honestly locate ourselves, we form the basis of meeting with other people and being able to establish trust. Because, you know, I don't feel like I can automatically trust Black women. Pro-capitalist, I mean, Condoleezza Rice, for example, she's a fascist Black woman. You know, just because she's a Black woman doesn't mean that we have trust. So I would say to you, the best thing we can do in terms of creating community across differences is to focus on what are the values that we share. What do we have in common? If you love justice and I love justice, how do we come to the table of that shared love for justice and talk about how we relate to one another? We have to talk about not just what causes us to differ, but what we have in common. So that we can think about, like with Black people in my life, I think, what do we share in common? Because it's not enough for us to bond solely on the basis of our skin. With white people who step up to the table in my life, I want to know, what are your values? What are you willing to stand up for? Where is your moral and ethical courage? And that's the basis on which we can build community and communion. Thank you so much.
This program was sponsored by the Jesse and John Dans Fund. Since 1962, these lectures have been a forum for distinguished scholars of national and international reputation who have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe.